All right. For those of you out there in Facebook land, welcome to the IMC's presentation. This is just a little before the event preview. And I want to just mention briefly that we have a history harvest going on for IMC history. Here we are in the 20th year of the Independent Media Center. We're so excited to be celebrating it with a number of different panels and events. And if you're someone who's been involved in the IMC or visited the IMC in the last 20 years, and maybe have a memory or a document or a picture that you are able to share with us, that would mean a lot. We're working with a college class at the University of Illinois with Professor Catherine Oberdeck, who's doing a history harvest. And so you can go to this URL, www.ucimc.org/HH, and there'll be a questionnaire there where you can upload documents or tell a story. Even if you think it's too small to be important, we hope you'll take a look. Any little bit matters in telling the story, and we'd love everyone to participate. Certainly the IMC's history has been about people coming together to collaborate, all sorts of different folks. So again, www.ucimc.org/HH. Nothing's too small to tell us about, to upload to the History Harvest. And we'd love to see what you have to share, any pictures or documents, some old meeting notes, a pamphlet, and it could be something sort of directly related to organizing the IMC, or it could be a working group project from Books to Prisoners, something from the initiation of the bike project or the public eye, or perhaps you were part of an art gallery showing, or you visited an art gallery showing. Really anything that reminds you of the IMC, or that sort of is part of your history with the IMC, would be meaningful to us. So go ahead and just go to www.ucimc.org/HH for a little history. This is your advertisement about History Harvest here on the Independent Media Center's Facebook Live and Zoom event this evening. And we'll also be streaming on WRFU 104.5. I don't know if DJ BJ has joined us quite yet, but we appreciate him for helping get us live on the radio. And so for those of you on the radio, we have a little slide up here with the 20th anniversary IMC Heart, some pictures from the putting up of the tower, an event with some famous folks in town. It looks like Sundiata and Carol Ammons and Aaron Ammons and Shay Robinson are here in this photo. We have the old Main Street photo up here. And we're just encouraging you to, if you have just 5 minutes, to go take a survey at www.ucimc.org/history harvest and tell us about any documents or stories that you have from the history of the IMC. I'll go ahead and pass it along to Karen. Karen Medina, our outgoing president of the Independent Media Center board. My name is Miriam Larson. I'm the executive director here at the IMC, and I'm so grateful to everyone who's joining us this evening.
Karen, you're muted if you're speaking.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to manage the screen share and the mute at the same time. Anyway, let's go back to that. Okay, here we go. And I'll just mention about the History Harvest. It's also you are also helping the students if you participate in that. So even if you think it's a small thing and you really don't think it's going to be important to IMC, it probably is going to be important, but it's also going to be really important to the students to get to practice and to be collecting these things. My name is Karen Medina, and I want to welcome everyone. The Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center is extremely happy to welcome you here this evening. During this pandemic, we are isolated for the good of all, but we need to continue to build our empathy skills, to build community, to learn from each other, and share in great conversations like this one this evening. In 2021, the IMC will hold multiple events around the topic of developing our storytelling skills, a cornerstone skill in the time of a pandemic. Roger Ebert once wrote about what he considered the most important thing a movie can do. He wrote, "They take us outside our personal box of time and space and invite us to empathize with those of other times, places, races, creeds, classes, and prospects. I believe empathy is the most essential quality of civilization," end quote. During a pandemic, it is still important to continue to develop our empathy skills, to hear about the lived experiences of people outside our tightened circles. It is still important to experience other cultures, even when we cannot travel across town. We need to continue to read a lot and to create, experience, and share all sorts of art, especially storytelling. I believe that storytelling is a vital skill for journalists, history professors, union organizers, social activists, community builders, poets, artists, musicians, and even nonprofit boards. Now is the time to sharpen our storytelling skills in order to create the world we need. These 20th anniversary of the IMC events are supported in part by a City of Urbana Arts grant. It is my pleasure to acknowledge a few other grants that have kept us afloat this year. The UCIMC's programs are partially supported by a grant from the Illinois Arts Council Agency. The UCIMC is supported by the United States Regional Arts Resilience Fund, Phase 2, an initiative of Arts Midwest and its peer United States regional arts organizations made possible by an anonymous donor. A grant from the Arts Work Fund, Arts for Illinois Emergency Relief Fund, housed at the Chicago Community Trust. And the list goes on. The UCIMC is a proud member of Community Shares of Illinois. Community Shares members change minds, change laws, and change lives. The UCIMC is also a proud member of the Media Justice Network, a network of over 100 organizations fighting to win and secure racial, economic, and gender justice in a digital age. And I would like to thank Miriam Larson, the IMC's executive director, who applied for all these grants and keeps these relationships strong. We are very glad you are here tonight, virtually, the audience members and the panelists and the facilitator. You make this event worthwhile. This event is free, and that is important to us, that as many as possible have access to events like this. The Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center still needs to pay its bills so that the infrastructure for the events continues to exist. This is not a fundraiser, but donations are very much appreciated. The Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center is a grassroots organization committed to media, arts, and technology for social change. The UCIMC is home to WRFU Radio, the Public Eye newspaper, Makerspace, Books to Prisoners, and a number of local artists. Welcome to the importance of storytelling to historians, labor unions, and community building. The panel participants are Augustus Wood, Stephanie Furtado, David Johnson, Jim Barrett, and Ricky Baldwin, facilitator. These presenters this evening are 5 of the many people that make Urbana-Champaign an amazing community. They are well-read, they are community builders, they know history and economics, and they know how to tell the stories of the working class. With that, I will hand it over to the amazing Ricky Baldwin to introduce the 4 panelists individually.
Well, I appreciate being called amazing. Karen, my name is Ricky Baldwin. I'm a union rep with the Service Employees International Union Local 73 here in town. I'll be the facilitator. So I'm going to introduce the folks on the panel one at a time, and then they will be speaking for a few minutes, and then we'll have some more comments, and then we'd like to hear from you guys who are not on the panel. If you would like to ask some questions, we would like to hear them. So I'm going to begin facilitating rather than talking. But I want to say that this, I'm really looking forward to hearing what all these folks have to say. So I hope that you are too. They're some of the finest, most interesting folks that I know, and I'm not even exaggerating. So the first panelist that we're going to hear from is Jim Barrett. And if you don't know Jim, Jim Barrett grew up in Chicago and still lives there part of the time. Jim taught working class, urban, and immigration history and the history of race and race relations for 30 years at the University of Illinois. And his writing work has involved these topics and also the history of radicalism in the United States. Throughout most of that time, Jim was also active in local labor and socialist activity. Jim and Jenny Barrett were also in on some of the early work to establish the IMC. And so Jim has a presentation for us.
Thank you, Ricky. Thanks to everybody involved tonight in helping make this happen. And congratulations to IMC. Without going into any detail, I'll save it for the History Harvest. Jenny Barrett and I were involved in the early stages, not so much lately, in getting the IMC going. In fact, I think our names are still on a mortgage document somewhere there. And the institution has several routes that I won't go into, but one of them, and it was the way that we had some involvement on the early end, was through a socialist forum, which thrived in the 1990s. And I'm glad to see there are some people on here tonight from that group. When I told a friend who's on tonight, Jermaine Light, about the panel, she asked what I thought was a good question. She said, "This is about stories. Are there going to be any love stories?" So I want to come back to love stories toward the end of what I have to say. But I'm going to begin with a story about a certain kind of history, history from what I would call history from the bottom up. And then just a little bit maybe on the importance of stories in the context of working class movements. So my interest in what you might call people's history or history from the bottom up stemmed from seeing a poem, which some people here may have seen. It's called A Worker Reads History. It's a Bertolt Brecht poem. And it starts with the lines, "Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. Was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone?" And then it goes on to ask similar questions about the great events in world history and the great men that were behind those events. At around the same time that I saw Brecht's poem, and incidentally, this was in the Chicago Seed, which was an underground newspaper in the late 60s in Chicago. And around that same time, I read Upton Sinclair's story of the Chicago stockyards, The Jungle, which was published in 1907. I was 19 years old when I read that. And it's a story of a neighborhood that was a little bit like the neighborhood that I grew up in. I have all kinds of criticisms of The Jungle, which I won't go into, but I think it did convey to me the idea, it kind of sparked the idea that people like me and like the community that I was from, working class people, actually had their own history. And not only that, but that that history was important. As I came to develop a theory about history, you know, why things happen the way they do, I'd argue, in fact, that it's especially important. It's really the driving force in history. So I became a historian from the bottom up, then to tell this story. And by definition, this story involved, rather than great men, it involved a lot of anonymous historical actors. And because we were dealing with a lot of people, that generation of historians, and now I'm talking about the late 60s and the 1970s, collected data of all kinds on large numbers of people. We worked with some of the early computer-assisted research. We used computers in the work that we did. And a lot of these new historians, people of my generation, eschewed narrative, basically stories, and instead strove for broad generalizations. The bottom-up generation of historians rebelled against an earlier form of history that focused largely on older, white, male elites, presidents, other high-ranking politicians, captains of industry, quote unquote, and high-profile intellectuals. These earlier historians had a strong tendency to glorify the elite story and to leave everyone else out, to excuse the racial, gender, and class oppression that was very much at the core of US history. So I continue to identify as a historian from the bottom up. I believe it's really transformed our understanding of the story of the United States. And I would be glad to talk more about that. But again, I think what was too often left out of a lot of this was real stories, stories about the experiences of working class people. And in fact, I've always thought that story, the kind of everyday history of the United States as a society, is actually a lot more dramatic than a lot of this elite history. So part of that story does focus on the history of organized labor, which was one of our topics tonight, and other people here can actually address better than I can. So in that case, we're talking about unions, working class political organizations, strikes, and so on. And there was just one point that I wanted to make about that, and maybe illustrate with an example that's close to home for most of us here. And that point is that the stories of success and victory are very important to those of us concerned with strengthening the labor movement. GEO's organizing and the really, you know, for somebody that's interested in strikes, the really splendid strikes, especially the 2009 strike, which was led largely by young women, including Stephanie, who's on the panel tonight, but also the more recent strike led by, among others, Gus, who's on the panel tonight. Those are all stories of victories and success, and they're important. GEO's story taught a number of lessons, with the most basic being simply that the university administration and the institution of the university, with far more resources at its disposal, could in fact be beaten. And the university administration was beaten in both these strikes for interesting reasons that, again, people here can talk about better than I can. And indeed, this successful strike by GEO was the impetus for the faculty campaign to pursue collective bargaining. There'd been a faculty campus, faculty union on campus from before the time that I arrived, which was 1984, but it never had collective bargaining rights. And so really, and this was literally talked about at meetings, on the strength of GEO's success, we made the decision, big decision, to pursue collective bargaining. And for those of you that know that story, which I won't go into, the bigger effort was not successful so far. I'm convinced that the faculty, all the faculty at the University of Illinois will be organized and under contract eventually. But for those of you that don't know, it was partially successful. There was a new local union formed of non-tenure track and contingent faculty. I'm one of these guys that thinks everybody needs a union, but I think that the contingent and non-tenure track faculty in particular needed a union, and they got one. And so I would argue that in a lot of ways you can trace back to what happened with GEO. It was one of my favorite moments at the University of Illinois, is that 2009 strike. But the stories of significant labor loss and defeat are also important to understand, as important or maybe more important than the stories involving victory. And one of the ones that I learned a lot from was, again, in the Chicago stockyards. There was a wonderful movement that developed there during the First World War and had a lot of short-term success, but in the long run was defeated in large part, I would argue, because of race prejudice and racial conflict on the South Side in Chicago. And in terms of lessons, when the stockyards workers rebuilt their movement, probably one of the most progressive unions in the history of labor in the United States, the Packing House Workers Union, they systematically organized over this problem of race prejudice. In other words, they recognized from the beginning, even whatever their personal feelings were about it, that this was not going to work unless you had real integration at the level of work and at the level of organization. And they did that, and it was a remarkably successful union. So successful that the stockyards moved out of Chicago and they moved into non-union areas much further away. Likewise in Decatur in the early 90s, where these really younger people here especially that didn't go through it should go back and take a look at these really, huge conflicts that took place in Decatur. Firestone, Caterpillar, and the most famous one, which was at Archer Daniel Midland's. These were all losses, all these. Some of them were not strikes, they were lockouts, but they were all lost by the labor organizations. But one important lesson, more than one I'm sure, but one that really struck me was the lesson that when you're in a conflict with a multinational corporation, you have to take an international approach to the struggle. And it was remarkable to see. There were contacts between not labor leaders, quote unquote, but rank and file workers in the plants in Decatur. And in the case of Archer Daniel Midland's, with sugarcane workers in the Caribbean, to try to see if they could get leverage through that kind of international organization. So these are all losses, but I think really important lessons were won. So as today's historians like to remind us, and there's a number of my colleagues on tonight, so I'm speaking to them, I suppose, now. They like to remind us that history is chaotic and that it's, to use one of the buzzwords, it's contingent rather than predictable or determined. I actually agree with all that. But in terms of accessibility to all kinds of people, not just to other historians, but to people that could really benefit a lot from the study of history in terms of the usefulness of history. I believe what I used to tell colleagues in the history department when I was the chair of the department there, I used to tell them, the people of the state of Illinois are not paying you to tell them history is complicated. They would like you to be able to explain history a bit to them, and even better, to be able to make connections with their own lives. The story is indeed complex, but it's the responsibility of historians to explain that and to try to, make it accessible to all different sorts of people. Accessible history consists of stories that are relevant to people's lives. And that brings us back to love stories, believe it or not, to Jermaine's question about whether or not that's part of what we're talking about tonight. Because people's history, what I'm calling people's history, is not all unions and strikes. What gives those struggles meaning is the people, the families, the communities, the sorts of people that are behind them, and maybe more importantly, the question of why they're involved in these ways in the movement. If we think about our own motivations, why we do things, and we're honest with one another, I think that we would recognize that emotions and personal relationships are very important in motivating us. We act in the interests of those we love. We love in a lot of different ways, through union brothers and sisters, but also I am talking about families and communities. And we act in opposition to those we disdain and sometimes hate. Recent personal experience has made me think more about love in all of its different forms and the relationship between love stories and the story of working people. Why should we expect the emotional content of our historical subjects, in my case, common people, working people, why should we expect that to be so different from our own experience? So I would leave you with this, that people's history should definitely include love stories. To answer Jermaine's question, I hope these young people especially, but all of us appreciate that. Old people love as well as young people. And I think it's very much a part of history, for sure, as a discipline, that telling of stories. And I think it's also part of working class life and experience and that story. So thanks again for inviting me to take part tonight. And I'm looking forward to seeing what other people have to say. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jim. I'm sure you appreciate that as I do. Our next panelist is actually not here, I don't think. So we'll come back to him if he manages to get on to join us. We'll we'll have Stephanie Furtado next, who Jim mentioned, of course. Stephanie is a lecturer at the University of Illinois Labor Education Program, providing workshops and extension programming for unions and the general public on the Champaign-Urbana campus and throughout Illinois. As part of her job, Stephanie's co-director of the annual Regina V. Polk Women's Labor Leadership Conference. Before joining the university, Stephanie served as the executive director of the Illinois Labor History Society, ILHS, the oldest statewide labor history organization in the United States. She's currently a board member for ILHS, as well as for the Mother Jones Heritage Project. She's a proud member and treasurer of her union, NTFC Local 6546, which Jim mentioned, part of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. Stephanie, what do you want to say to us?
Right. Well, thanks. I want to acknowledge how fantastic it is to see everybody. There's a lot of people on this call that I just love a very great deal and have missed a very great deal over the last, really strange year. So it's just so cool to see everybody. In my office at the U of I, over there on the corner of Armory and Fifth, I have on my bulletin board, and Jim Barrett has heard me say this before, so I have on my bulletin board a picture. I made it with my super awesome cut and paste skills. I have a picture of a work boot with the heel of the boot on the spade of a shovel, digging into some good earth. And next to it, it says, dig where you stand. And the first time I ever heard that phrase, I can't remember what it was. I think it was one of those, we're trying to get you to come to our school grad student meetings that we used to have at the U of I, where we bring people to campus and try to entice them to come. I think that's what it was. But I remember once Jim was talking about the idea of doing history and being active in your community and digging and he just said this phrase, dig where you stand. And man, it just like knocked me out. Like when he said it, I was like, oh, I really like that. To me explains what I want to do. Because there's a bunch of things about it. Like, so first of all, I think, especially when I was a grad student here, there's this feeling of temporariness, right? There's this feeling that whatever your life is going to be is the next chapter, and you're just getting through this. And why I like the dig where you stand thing is because it said, like you got to dig in where you are, right? You can't wait. Like where you are, there is, and I also just like it because it's work, right? So it's dig where you are, but get to work where you are, which I just really like that. But then the other thing that I really like about it is that it is, I found this out later, it is about history. This is, of course, if Jim Barrett said it, it has something to do with something specific in history, right? And what it is it comes from, in the 1970s, there was this movement trying to get workers to tell their own history. That workers should be able and should be empowered to tell their own history. And there's this great article that was put in the Oral History Journal in 1979 by the leader of that Swedish movement, Sven, I'm not going to say this right, so I'm going to try, Sven Lundquist. And he's talking about what this whole concept of dig where you stand. At the very end of the article, he says this. He says, those who are to conquer the company must first conquer the picture of the company. A new picture must be created, a picture that puts workers and their work in the foreground. And so now what I do is I'm a labor education person here at the U of I, and I teach unions. Like I go out and I teach, pipe fitters history. I teach communications, I teach economics, I teach lots of different subjects. I also teach undergrads. And I was thinking about this the other day, that basically and it's probably like, people probably sometimes think I'm a little bit of a crazy person, but like what I teach is basically every single class comes down to trying to figure out how we can equip workers to tell their stories. So like when I teach my media class, almost the whole class is me trying to get the folks in the class to think about their own labor story, why the union matters to them, why the issue that they care about matters to them. When I teach organizing, and I did this once with my own union with Christina D'Angelo, we were asked to do a class around internal organizing for our own union, like a workshop, because we're going to do this internal organizing drive. And we had this exercise where at the beginning, we asked everyone there to tell the story of how they got organized into the union. And it took so long and everybody talked so much that was basically most of what we did, right? Everything else that we had planned. But the thing was, it was like for me, it was like super powerful. When I teach my economics class, like I teach folks things like, you know, this is why a defined benefit pension matters, and this is what right to work is. But 90% of what I'm doing is talking to them about, you know, this stuff. This is your lived experience. This matters to you. Prevailing wage, if you're a plumber, matters to you. How do you tell that to your family members? How do you empower your own story to make sense of your economic life, right? And so for me, and I think this really hit in a lot of ways, just sort of really hit home. I was involved in organizing the 2009 strike, and to Jim's point about that labor history is a love story. Yeah, like the reason I got involved in the union, the reason that I gave so much of my time to the union was because at the core of the union were people that I deeply loved and still do, right? And we together thought it was possible to transform the space that we worked in. And when one of those people, Carrie Pimblock, came back leading up to the strike that Gus led a few years later, they flew her back into town to talk. She was our lead organizer in the strike, and she was the lead bargaining person in the bargaining room. And they flew her back to tell the story of the GEO strike and why it worked to the next generation of GEO people. And somebody asked, well, you know, why did you win? And there's a lot of reasons that I could say why we win. Like we had Google Docs that I could tell you every door who was going to be on it. You know, I mean, it was intense organizing. There was a lot of reasons that I could say why we won. But without missing a beat, what Carrie said was, oh, we had better stories. And we got our members to tell the stories, right? So it's, for me, being now involved in labor, that whole concept of dig where you stand weds what I think about history and what I think about labor. And just I'll sum up by saying, if there's some books that you want to read, especially about like the history side and doing this kind of history, the first is from the late Jim Green's Taking History to Heart, which just knocks me out. The second is Jim Barrett's Bottom Up. And then the third is a book that's not written by necessarily an historian, but just has been knocking me out a lot lately. And that is Barbara Kingsolver's Holding the Line, the story of striking mine workers and the women that basically supported that strike in 1983 in Arizona. And why that book is so powerful is it's just beautiful. It's a story of these working women, but what it is, it's a story, and it's in a strike that was lost, like Jim was saying. But what's so beautiful about that book is it's the story of women who, through labor organizing, are connected to their own lives and their own stories and become empowered to tell their own stories and to speak them into the world. And it's like, I assigned it for my undergrads last semester, and I have some labor women in a class that I'm teaching right now that are reading it coming up here for Women's History Month. But in terms of a book that really just, to me, encapsulates workers telling their own stories in a way that's super powerful, because a lot of the book is just her letting the workers have the space and the page to tell their stories. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about lately when I got this, and I'm really excited for the Q&A, and I'll give it back to Ricky.
Okay, great. You guys are making me want to speak because there's so many stories. But I want everybody to hear from Gus, and if Dave joins us, hopefully from him too. So our next panelist is Augustus Wood, who is a scholar of political economy and gentrification, labor and social movements in the late 20th and early 21st century African-American urban history. He's currently a postdoctoral research associate in the labor education program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Wood has authored articles that appear in the Labor Studies Journal, co-authored book chapters with Dr. Sundiata Chajua. He is the editor of the upcoming special edition of Labor Studies Journal on Black workers and COVID. He is a contributor on Rutledge's forthcoming Encyclopedia of Anti-Racism. He is formerly two-term co-president of the Graduate Employees Organization, the GEO. We've been talking about Local 6300, one of the coordinators for the 2018 GEO strike, and member of the Champaign County AFL-CIO Executive Council. He hosts the Radio Free Labor program on 90.1 FM, WEFT, Champaign Radio. Take it away, Gus.
I just want to say, first of all, I'm just honored to be in the presence of so many wonderful people. Jim knows that his work has been very foundational to the work that I do, as my work is bottom-up working class history from a political economic perspective. And so I'm just always honored to share space with him. And of course, Stephanie knows that she's my sister, and I know she's pretty much tired of seeing me since she sees me all the time now, since we're planning all this stuff and we're doing all this work together. And of course, Ricky, we've struggled so much together over the years. So I'm just really glad to just be around so many awesome people. And I'm just thankful to Karen and the wonderful IMC for doing this type of work, because again, this is one of the reasons why I chose to stay in Champaign-Urbana, is because we have spaces and people like this that are adamant in terms of building community and solidarity and asking the critical questions, which ties directly into what I'm going to talk about today. There was a bunch of things that I thought about talking about, and while there's been a lot more personal stuff that a lot of people have gone on, I'm going to go a little more broad and actually kind of do the stakes of history and the stakes of storytelling, because I think that we're at a moment in our time, and I think it's always adamant for us as scholars or organizers to analyze where we currently are and what we're going to do moving forward. So one of the things that I always think about is this quote from Karl Marx, where he quoted that men make history, but not of their own free will, not under circumstances they themselves have chosen, but under given and inherited circumstances with which they are directly confronted. And I don't think, end quote, and I don't think there's anybody that can deny that we are confronting a lot right now, for lack of a better term. What I want people to come away with is this argument that it sounds very common, but I don't think that it's as central as it used to be. And this kind of ties into what Jim is saying, that it is paramount that storytelling in history be a paradigm of human liberation. It is a method for understanding the world in order to change it. The best historical storytelling, for me, has always shown that the structures of any given society present individuals, social groups, neighborhoods, etc., with numerous choices and avenues for specific political action, particularly at moments of intense social crisis like now, like the radical 1930s, the Black Power movement, the subaltern movements in other countries. The actions of even a single individual or these types of groups can have profound consequences for this course of history. So the question remains, how is this history told, and how do we use it for the future? Particularly now, as was the case in those periods I listed before, as you had so much more struggle on the ground occurring, as working class groups and organizations across the world They built these powerful movements. They had these moments. You throw in 2015, 2020, et cetera. You have history being taught and historians being trained in specific places where there's deliberate and politically motivated effort to change the facts of history so that the storytelling reflects a false perspective of this exceptionalism of the American system and these so-called values that usually turn around to be individualism, exploitation, violence, and the key thing for today, anti-intellectualism. At the heart of this new nadir historical moment that we're currently in, the fact that anti-intellectualism and historical storytelling has been key in expanding what I call a neo-nativist movement, which is grounded in a vision of white upper-class corporate supremacy at the expense of all other racial classes in the nation. When the ruling classes did not wipe out racial oppression at the end of the US Civil War, and instead facilitated the creation of a new racial formation with a new South that had this repressive social structure with anti-Black lynching as the main mechanism for social control of the sharecropping structure and the plantation economy as it changed. You know, this new political economy that occurred, it pushed a critical multi-dimensional transformation of the system out of the storytelling for the sake of new forms of accumulation. And we have to understand that there were so many groups and individuals on the ground questioning the very system that was at the heart. And this was during a period known as Reconstruction. In other words, you had different groups in the ruling class that buried the history and promoted a revisionist narrative that moved slavery, racism, labor exploitation to the back of the causes for the war, or just got rid of them altogether. Minimalizing these core problems in the American structure is ahistorical and simply appeases those who hold hopeful breath for that white supremacy to remain the dominant form in society. The anti-intellectualism fueled the US structure escaping having to fully confront and rectify its history of exploitation and racial oppression. The lack of attention to genuine historical storytelling has produced change instead of progress in our society. As W.E.B. Du Bois outlined in his text, Black Reconstruction, are the whims of the right wing or corporate oligarchy sufficient for denying legitimate historical storytelling and consequently progress? If the record of human action is going to be set down with accuracy and faithfulness to detail, particularly from the working classes or from the bottom up, so we can use it as a measuring rod and guidepost for progressive transformation, it is our duty and responsibility as historians or scholars or organizers to promote an intellectual form of historical storytelling, which simply means critical thinking, discussion, debate, the formulation of alternative frameworks, theoretical development, the application to local spaces, and of course, love stories. Because this means to critically analyze our material conditions, our day-to-day lives, so as to inform our questions at the base of any type of framework for a revolutionary transformation. This means asking and always answering these three questions. Where are we? How do we get here? And how do we get better? And those make for some of the best storytelling narratives. However, if we continue down the path of appeasement, anti-intellectualism, and therefore this false populism, if we are simply going to misuse history for some gross pleasure or amusement, like inflating a national ego, hint, hint, or pursuing affluent dreams, or giving this false sense of accomplishment as a nation, then we must abandon history and publicly admit that American historical learning is merely social engineering, as the late great Hal Barron argued, for future generations of these individualists and neo-nativists who seek to either love being an upper-class white male or hate themselves for not being an upper-class white male or in a better place for society. We cannot continue down that path. Currently, the Trump acolytes and the neo-nativists in general, many of whom hold incredible power and sway in our political economy, propagandize history as lies agreed upon to remove the power of white people. Anti-intellectualism is, of course, driving the force of fascists, which is a lot of things that people don't realize is more so about accumulation and power than simply about individual hatred. And until we confront the truth that the nation has eluded since 1865, that the US ruling classes have fought for centuries to racially antagonize the population to more efficiently exploit our labor, our social conditions will always change, but they will never progress. Why don't we use storytelling to confront the fact that the United States did not outlaw any semblance of the Confederacy after the Civil War, including these supposedly treasonous symbols like the Confederate flag, commemorative statues and plaques, and all these other things that somehow appeared in the Capitol on last Wednesday? Why don't we use storytelling to confront the fact that anti-intellectual narratives in history have, for some reason, promoted that Black Americans are the only group of people in history that have no real role in our own freedom, which, of course, anybody with good sense would know is highly improbable. Because if you tell the real story of the slaves and the general strike of 1863, where over 500,000 slaves withheld their labor in a strike against the Confederacy's war capabilities, then it shows that the most determinant factor in the North reversing the tide and finally winning the war was an organized labor strike predominantly by Black slaves. Could the current American system of political subjugation, economic exploitation, and social humiliation rest on that type of historical storytelling? Absolutely not, because it will produce progress instead of just change. Now, as the coming days grow darker and we're forced to confront a lot of issues as we try to rebuild some semblance of any movement activity or our communities following this pandemic and the horrificness of the explicit fascism, we have to remember to always emphasize critical thought in our storytelling, base our storytelling and history on evidence, and emphasizing reading and rigor. We must uncover more subaltern working class documents and voices in our history that offer a more genuine and dialectical narrative of interpretation. The archives of administrative records and upper class papers, their significance in that we must read them against the grain. We must use them to strengthen our critique of the means of oppression. We must no longer let these documents and records protect or uphold the very groups that produce them. We as scholars and organizers must seize hold of state and local school boards and restructure curriculum to centralize African-American history, Latinx history, labor history. The histories of struggle must be the dominant form of history from kindergarten through graduate school. Those in power do not respect that type of intellectualism, and they spend billions of propaganda to turn people away from that type of storytelling. Critical thinking and evidence strengthens our storytelling abilities because it ties us directly to our current day-to-day conditions, and that builds relationships that long-term lead to the things that Stephanie and I and others on here who've ever been engaged in any type of struggle on the ground are committed to do. Those types of relationships build commitment, and that's how collectively we get stronger. That is the key to why storytelling and history are central to anything that we do in terms of progress and equality for human society. So let's challenge that system that pushes anti-intellectualism, and let's always push for critical thinking and an intellectual understanding of ourselves, our people, and the world. And we will have progress versus change. And that's the best love stories that we can always offer each other. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gus. Wow. So we have some time. We've heard some heard from some great folks. We have one panelist who didn't make it, unfortunately, so we have a little more time than we thought. But what we had thought, and this is, of course, if the panelists want to cooperate, we can't make them do anything. But our thought was that after these initial presentations, they might have sparked some thoughts from folks. I know they did in me. So our panelists might have some additional thoughts, and while they're sharing any of those with us that they have, folks who are joining, who have been listening so far, might have some questions to ask or some things that they want to bring up. And if you want to do that, you can mention it in the chat, and Karen or somebody will read them out and ask the panelists your questions, that kind of thing we can do. Or, you know, I think that it's probably okay. Somebody who's working the technical end of this will tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that we can probably try people speaking up as long as that works. And everybody doesn't speak at once. If that starts happening, I guess we could try the raising hand function on Zoom. But if you haven't used it before, you know, I guess people might have a little trouble with that. So what we could try is first those two things. You can either put it in the chat or just speak up. But first, we wanted to ask the panelists if listening to each other, they had any additional thoughts to share with us. In no particular order, just you know, you've been listening to each other speak, and I know that you know each other. Everybody on the panel knows each other, but you know, if something that someone said made you think of something else that you wanted to add. Nobody's jumping at the chance. You know what? You know what I thought? I'm just going to tell you this. You guys mentioned the 2009 strike so many times. That what I remembered from that strike, and you know, maybe this is not the kind of story you guys are thinking about, but how bad the weather was. It was rainy and cold, and I remember that particularly because it did not stop, or it didn't seem to impede the strike in any way. I mean, this weather was bad. If you weren't there, it was so bad that I know that I was able to take the sign that I'd been holding in the rain and just stick it to my body. I didn't have to hold it. My hands could just be free because it was so soaking wet, and I was so wet that I could just stick it to my body and walk around with the sign that way. But these folks, they didn't like stop striking because the rain was pouring and they were all afraid they were going to catch pneumonia. They seemed to enjoy it. They celebrated. It was the most amazing thing. I think it was because they were doing something they believed in. But it looks like I've wasted enough time now that we may be getting something. Ken Solo has something to say. Great contributions, thanks. And can they speak more about the relation between stories and power? That seems to be to anyone of you three who want to offer something. The relationship between stories and power.
I'll try it. I don't know if I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Okay. So the most obvious thing of all, which is, you know, it's often said the victors write the history. And Gus gave a couple of examples of, you know, where that makes a difference. But the big area, obviously, is in education, and, you know, especially young people. So our AFL-CIO, the Champaign County AFL-CIO, for several years had a labor history in the schools committee. And I don't know exactly how far we got, but I think that it's just so obvious that the stories kids grow up with shapes, you know, their questions, of course, but also their expectations. So if you're told over and over and over again that you can't do anything about this, that this whole system is just a given and there's nothing to do, that really makes a big difference. Now, I know Ken, and his question may be calling for a far more sophisticated answer than I've suggested. But I think that, you know, young people, all of us, but I mean, young people, I'm thinking especially about, are hearing stories all the time. And, you know, what stories they hear and, you know, what those stories seem to say is really vital. We shouldn't underestimate the responsibilities that those of us that are involved in it have.
I should say Ken did, before you anybody else speaks, Ken did add a clarifying comment to his question, specifically what makes working class stories compelling for other workers across gender and racial lines.
So, you know, I agree. I think there's two things that I want to say. I think, first of all, we know that story is powerful because otherwise the people in power wouldn't spend so much time and energy trying to suppress stories from being told. I remember a couple of years ago, the great labor historian Elliot Gorn, whose big book is on Mother Jones, came to campus to talk about his new book about the Emmett Till's murder. And I had my students could go for an undergrad, or my undergrad students could go for extra credit, and they had to write a paper. And almost, you know, as all of you who teach on campus know, most of my students from the Chicago suburbs. And my one student who wrote this paper, a young Latinx woman, wrote this paper in response to his talk. And at the end, it began with, you know, I didn't know this story. I didn't know this history. And I grew up in Chicago. And at the end, in all caps, she wrote, they didn't teach us this in school, and that is not okay. And it's not okay. That like that one of the ways I think that power operates is by suppressing stories. And the reason why is, if you know Emmett Till's story, it gives you a very different perspective on the civil rights movement, on the city of Chicago. You know what I mean? It matters that that story isn't taught. But in terms of how stories transcend, and why I think so much of my teaching is trying to figure out ways to get people to tell their own stories and to articulate themselves and their experience and their work into the world, is because I've seen firsthand how powerful it is. And Ricky, I'm going to tell a story that involves your union. SEIU was organizing in a lead up. I don't remember if this was the time you went on strike or not. I think it might have been in the lead up. And we were over at Channing Murray. And we had this event. Not a lot of people came because, you know, that's how it always is, right? And it was between the Graduate Employees Union and workers, food and building service workers. Okay, so two really different classed, right, type of workers. And if you know anything about the GO, there's always a lot of English. There's a lot of people from the English department that are there. And I'll never forget, one of the workers who cleans the English building talked with great passion about how they used to take pride in their work, that they would clean that English building, and when they were done, it looked good. And they only had to clean like 2 floors of it. But now, because of cuts in the budget, they have to clean the whole building, plus go do some other side job, and how the building looks like crap all the time. And they don't take pride in their work anymore, because how could they? They don't do a good job. And then one of the grad students from English talked about how that when they first got here, they're, you know, a long-term grad student, they were able to do, they felt like a better job teaching, but now their course load is bigger. And now, instead of actually giving people actual feedback on their writing, that, you know, they don't have the same time that they did. And I just, and to this day, when I see the people that were there and who share their stories, I stop and talk to them, right? Like, because we found out was even though our labor on the campus was really different, we had so much solidarity between our experiences, right? And that power of connection. I remember when SEIU finally got their contract that time, one of the people who were there brought over this big bowl of lifesavers to the grad local and said, you know, you all were lifesavers. Thank you for having our backs. And it was one of the people who were there. I think one of the things that's powerful about stories is we connect through stories.
Yeah, I think Stephanie's 100% correct. Really, that was the only reason that any of our strikes was successful in the first place, is that was because of the storytelling abilities to cut across different parts of the campus. I mean, you know, this one of the things that is very adamant and the university administration wasn't expecting was the amount of support that we had in the natural sciences and engineering quads, which has always been the storytelling of that to us has always been that they are so adamantly anti-labor that you just don't go there, you don't approach them. You know, they make all this money. They're not gonna, those graduate workers are not gonna understand the plight of poor Black students or poor brown students in EPOL or other places. How, you know, you just can't do that. But one of the things that we recognize more so than any other point was that, yeah, once you actually sit down and talk with people, you know, you have conversations and you exchange stories, there's always some common ground of something not quite right with the way we're working, and that conditions just aren't, you know, whether it be that my issues were solely about the actual pay itself, their issues were more so about tuition waivers and the fact that they understood that both of our struggles came from the same power source. Then that automatically lit them up. And we, you know, once we started having those types of conversations, we actually were recruiting stewards in departments that hadn't had stewards before, didn't even know of the union. And so again, when it comes to the issues of being oppressed or having exploitative labor, regardless of where you are on any spectrum, there is something there that connects once you start learning and developing relationships with people. And then once you get them in the door, and we know we had this kind of numbering system we did where 1, 2, 3s, and 4s, ones being the most agitated, we called it, the 4s being don't come around us because we will report you because we don't like labor folks. When you have a bunch of 2s and 3s who are simply like, this sounds like it connects to me, you get them in the door there, you actually connect with them via building relationships. It's not solely just inviting them to an event, but you're actually talking and learning about them and their issues and treating them like a person, something that the other side rarely talks about or wants to do. Then they start feeling like, okay, I can commit to doing this. And the more you struggle together, whatever you do, the more you escalate actions and you both show up and you do these things, the stronger that commitment comes. Not only are you deepening the storytelling and the narrative itself, but you're deepening the relationship over time. That's how you build social movements out of moments, is having those connections multiply at such an accelerated rate. And that's how you shift the power balance, because when the university or any employer has a group of people who are individually thinking about their own specific power and who have never shared stories or built relationships, then they have very little power. But the minute they come together and build those structures together through storytelling, through relationship building, because again, that's the first thing that Stephanie talked about this as well. I do the exact same thing. The first thing I do when my students come into a classroom, their first assignment is to tell me about themselves. I want to know where they came from. I want to know their first instance of experiencing inequality or struggle, something like that. That's their first assignment. And that does is that opens up not only the vulnerability aspect of it, but it's like, yo, we're all like, we've experienced something that we can connect on. And so that's what we have to emphasize. And that's how critical thinking comes about under the issue of power and storytelling.
Excellent. We have another question in the chat. I just wanted to add about that, what you guys are saying, if I can. Well, Dave's not here, so I'll fill in for Dave. But, you know, when I first met some of the building service workers that Stephanie was talking about before that struggle, you know, I can't tell you how many of them said to me, I want to go on strike, but none of these others want to go on strike, right? So once I heard that from about 100 people, you know, I realized that all that we really needed to do was connect them so that they could tell that to each other, and then they would start organizing. And it was important for them to be able to share those. We've got another comment and some questions attached in the chat that I don't want to skip over, though, from Nils Jacobson. I am thoroughly convinced of the power of stories to motivate people for action. The stories link emotions to collective experience, but if, as Jim, Stephanie, and Gus all implied, the stories are to serve progress or liberation, does that not always imply that the stories must be informed by specific ideas, goals, purposes, values, and would those not have to be there before the stories? So, sort of asking you to dig a little bit deeper into what you're saying, in a sense.
Yeah, I'm glad that's been brought up, because there's also the flip side of this. And again, last Wednesday is a very good example of the use of narrative and that false issue, the issue of the anti-intellectualism that I brought forth, that creates those values, that creates those ideas, that creates this sense, that creates these material. I mean, again, the thing that's really important to understand is, and it's always important to me, is that when we talk about culture, culture must always be tied directly to the conditions of what's happening on the ground. And I think a lot of the things here, particularly when you have, and again, we don't want to scapegoat Trump as being this one figure, because again, these are the things that he exacerbated, have been building for decades. Remember, a lot of the stuff, a lot of the anti-intellectualism, a lot of the neo-nativist stuff that I mentioned that comes about now have been building since the late 80s and the 90s, when there weren't anti-working class political ideas and structures flying around, particularly in the late 1980s. And really, when that recession hit in the 1990s, you had the two-party structure actually reassessing how the accumulation of capital would be distributed amongst the different classes of people in the country. And so when you get hit by so many recessions, you get hit by so many things over time. A lot of these ideas that have been around since the 1860s, well, not really 1860s, but before then, but a lot of these things that are festering and they're surviving and they're changing their structure, then they now have a module or a voice to complement them more so heavily than they had before. And again, we a lot of all three of us mentioned the issue of the media and how it deconstructs narratives to form these false populist ideas. In that, no, the only way that the reason why we look the way we do and we're not that the U.S. is not great is because of so much kowtowing to oppressed groups who don't deserve to be in that echelon. And so that type of building and breaking down of storytelling and narrative is incredibly critical to the dialectic here. And so, yeah, I'm glad that Professor Jacobson brought this up, because I think that's something that we often, we definitely, we always have to talk about those victories and talk about the love and all that. But again, we have to understand that we have to be on the offensive here. We have to understand that we have to combat something that Wednesday has proven has grown to such a high extent that we can't be defensive anymore. We have to seek out and restructure the way we tell stories and change the values, not reform, but completely restructure the values of how we build stories that pass from people to people, from groups to groups, via public education or via just our own personal lives. And so that's a long-term project, of course. I'm not trying to simplify it, but that's where it actually begins. We have to pay attention to those things, and we have to be very, very critical when things come around. Certain things should not be able to exist simply because they can. We have to be upfront, particularly as scholars, and challenge these narratives. You know, I miss those kinds of days when somebody puts out a book like Time of the Cross, and then somebody comes out and says, oh, okay, I got a whole book I'm writing to show you why you're wrong and dangerous, slavery in the numbers game. I miss those days. We need to get back to that. But I'm being facetious, but I'm being somewhat honest here in that I think that we as particularly in the historical profession, you know, we're not the only ones, but I do think that we have a duty in doing those kinds of things and setting the record straight. And that's a very difficult conversation that's longer than this event is, but that's where it starts.
So no, I'm glad you asked this question. So I made a sort of a transfer. I still am an historian, but I work in labor education, and I'm on the board of the United Association for Labor Education. And I remember I went to my first conference from that group a few years ago in Seattle. And about halfway through, I was like, so what is, like, can anybody just explain to me what is labor education? And actually, a colleague of mine and I are working on trying to write an article on that, because I don't feel like that, like the discipline I now find myself in has been theorized, frankly, at all. But one of the things that I think is core to it, and when I teach, like I frequently will say, like, hey, listen, just so you know, I'm teaching and I'm coming at you with the perspectives that workers matter and that workers deserve, like, to have fair wages and come home safe to their families. Like, that is a personal bias I'm bringing into the teaching. And I think that the project of labor education is liberation for working people. And so, yeah, like, I think, like, acknowledging and thinking about that framework. But then to the end of your question about values, when I teach my media class, I have this 8-hour Saturday media class I teach. And the first hour is about values. The first hour, that's all we talk about is values and what do we value and why do we value it? And then the second whole hour is about story. And then the rest of it is talking to the media and everything we do, all the just practicing talking to the media on different issues, but it keeps coming back to what are your values and what are your stories? And the thing is if it only works if you have shared values. If that beginning part doesn't happen, the stories, you can only employ your story to build power is if you're trying to build it for the same set of values, right? Because let's be real, it's not, and this is the thing that I like about the Sven Lindquist piece. He's saying, look, the companies are telling their stories, right? They're out there. The powers that be, it's not that there's not stories being told. There are stories being told. They just are from a very different set of values. And if we're going to have stories that are powerful, we have to identify what are the values that we have. But then, like Gus says, do the rigorous scholarship, right? In order to make sure that what we're saying is actually grounded.
Patrick's writing in the chat, one of the great stories of the building trades is the history of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters, Empire in Wood by Robert Christie. I think it was his master's thesis. A fellow carpenter urged me to read it. Robert Christie knew where all the bodies were buried, in quotes. Reading this book as a young journeyman carpenter launched my thirst to become a student of labor history and to become an activist inside and outside my union.
I mean, I agree with that so much. If you said to me, what's the best thing that you could do with people that are first getting involved in the labor movement, get them a book in their hands and a book about the kind of work that they do and where their struggle came from. Like, that is so important.
I think a lot of communities have handing down of stories, like as part of their traditions. Like they hand it down to the young people before they can even understand what the meaning of the story is. And I see that labor unions often hand that down too. Like, you know, during the most recent strike, they tell about the older strike. And I think that's a really extremely valuable thing to do. And I know that like when you go into a workplace, they try to separate people and train them, and they train them with stories. For instance, like when I go to the prison out at in Danville, before COVID, to teach, they would take us off and individually, and the guards would tell us their stories of how they had to deal with things going on in the prison. And so they separate us from each other in order to pound us with the stories that they tell all the guards. And so we have to hear that. And I noticed that in when you're starting a job, they also want you to hear the stories that the administration wants to tell you, and not join together and hear the stories of when the workers got together and made it better, a better working place, a better employer, a better community. So we're often separated to keep those stories apart from each other, but we really need to share those stories, not only with our younger people and our fellow laborers, but you know, in song. We use song to tell stories. And yeah, sorry.
Oh, I think, Karen, you're exactly right. And that gets back to the Professor Jacobson's point about values and whatnot. You know, the very idea that you build everything that we would do in terms of storytelling, in terms of historical practice, it's in interpretation, we base on a particular core values. You know, it's interesting, the point you bring up too, is that when I go before the pandemic, when I would go to Pittsburgh and teach the steel workers, and one of the most interesting things is I walked into the room on my first time there. This was like 2016, I believe. And the name of the room, the banquet room, is the Carnegie Center for steel workers, for steel workers. And so literally the very first thing I asked them before, you know, we introduce each other, names and whatnot, and I say, do y'all like are y'all okay with this? Have y'all started a petition or held a meeting about this with your leadership? And they say, what's the issue? You know, and then once we break it down, they say that they've never heard of the steelworkers strike 1893. They never heard of it. And so that just goes to show you where we currently are in terms of the issues. And this, mind you, this was only 4 years ago. And this was only just one local. So where you can imagine where this is happening everywhere, where that's something that is as seminal and is pretty much the kind of the remaking of the steel worker movement in the United States was the breaking apart of the steel workers in that strike, and then them having to rebuild themselves over the next 40 to 50 years to get back to their strength. And they knew nothing about it whatsoever. And so their values were shaken up when we finished that session, and they were heated enough to write a letter to their labor leader about removing Carnegie's name afterwards. And that's just kind of goes to what we're talking about. And like, we can't just uncover these things. They have to be central. They have to be the most adamant aspect of the way we teach our history, and the way we produce, publish, and pass those stories is struggle. Is that nothing comes about because you just accept it, or just breaking apart that ignorance and learning about these kinds of issues. It has to be the core. And that's just one example of so many stories where we come along where people just didn't know or weren't exposed and were neglected of that type of history for a very political reason.
And that's why they don't teach. That's why they don't teach Black history, or very good history of African Americans in the United States in schools too. And that's why we have to learn it ourselves, is because they're not going to teach it.
One of my, I think I really like that story, Gus. You never told me that one before. I also think connecting.
So why don't they remove the Tea Party from history education in schools?
Oh, that's, why don't they remove the Tea Party?
Why don't they remove? I don't mean the modern one. I mean the Boston Tea Party.
Why would they want to?
I was bringing it up because I've used this as an example. Like when the Centennial students were being criticized for demonstrating in the street, why are these students being violent? I went to the school board and said, the last time when I was in school, they talked about the Tea Party. People were criticizing them because they were being obstreperous. And I said, okay, well, look, these admired people who are still in our school time history are very much admired, and they were way more obstreperous than those students ever were. So why isn't their story being suppressed too? They should be a good example.
I would argue because it's read backwards as, and I'm not saying that this is an accurate reading, but it's read backwards as white, male, privilege, who were, speaking out against unfair taxes. So that story is allowed to get in. I don't know. But I'm going to go back to what Gus was saying. I also think we need to connect to the places we are with story, and think about the spaces that we inhabit. One of my favorite examples of this, when I taught a lot in Greg Hall history, I had this thing that I did sometimes for my classes, and I'd say, all right, before we're going to learn any history, you have to tell me where we are. And I would send them out in groups into the building, and I would say, just tell me where we are. Tell me the history of where we're learning. And they would come back with all sorts of, I found this plaque, you know what I mean? One young student was an architecture student. So he told me about the architecture of the building and what he could learn from it. But I'll never forget one group, and just took a real long time to get back. And I was like, I think I've lost a group of students. I'm gonna have to go find them. And they came back and they were so excited. They had gone and they were looking at the pictures of the history faculty. And if you go back and you look at them before a certain date, it's just a bunch of white men, right? And so they were planning, and they told us about how looking at the pictures and how they changed over time can tell us something about the discipline of history. But Dave Roediger, the professor Roediger, when he was still here, heard them outside of his door. So he came out and he was like, what are you doing? And they were telling him, and he took them to a picture and he showed them. He's like, hey, do you see this picture right here? And it looks like a bunch of white men. And he pointed to somebody and he's like, I'm pretty sure this guy right here is passing, and that he actually was Black. And he told them a little bit about that. And they came back and they were like, did you know at the University of Illinois, there used to be a time that if you were Black, you probably couldn't have been, and they were really into it. And the one kid was like, this might be the most interesting class. And I was like, yeah, I mean, but I didn't do anything. I just sent them out and was like, with a set of, I think 3 questions, and said, you go find out. And then we did a whole thing about well, if you wanted to find out more about this or that, what would you do to try to find out more about it? And just from the jump, thinking about how we can empower people to tell their own stories, but also to dig into history and to think about where we are in the spaces that we inhabit, and that there's history in the spaces that we inhabit.
Ken had another question in the chat. Do panelists agree that we're talking about recentering what I know as oral history?
Well, definitely, just to start off that question, I'm a firm believer that oral history is one of the most important features of storytelling. And I come from the tradition of the African griots, that were passing down stories to not only continue the building of their particular societies, but also to learn the histories and to make sure that the past mistakes are never forgotten. You know, in my family, we pass down stories orally, you know, from my grandparents to my parents to myself and my sister. It's just something that has always been kind of second nature in my development. You know, I never really thought about much of it until I got it. I never thought about how central it was to the building of society until I got into more formalized graduate education, because I always thought it was just something that you just did. But the fact that I saw stories, I saw narratives that didn't have oral history in them, and understanding that there are different methods to doing history and realize it was contentious, I was very surprised by that. And I think that one of the great things that I learned from looking at works from Professor Barrett, meeting Stephanie and working with her, working with my advisor, Sundiata Chajua, other folks that I recognize in the past that have shown me that no, oral history is not simply about just the passing down the stories and looking at the future, but it can be a way to strengthen the storytelling of the historical profession, to change it, not change it, to progress it, to make it better, so that we're training a bunch of young historians. We're training people on not just the ability to communicate with one another, but that we're actually taking the stories and experiences from the people who are the most affected by a lot of the decision-making happening in the political economy. And so at the very heart of it, and this is why, you know, Marx becomes so important, is that dialectical connection that I keep going back to, is that the agency drives the structure, that there is that relationship that accounts for it. And the oral history, for at least in my experiences, and, you know, not trying to speak for Stephanie, but from hearing from her, as I consider her to be one of my favorite storytelling historians, since she has a story for everything. And if you know her, you know what I mean. That it really, it literally proves exactly that point, that it's driving what happens in the structure, and that most of these things that are happening are reactions. We have to understand that the right-wing violence is a reaction. It is not an organic or new idea that they just came up with. It's a reaction to what has been occurring on the ground, from working class people, from different groups, from the media, all these things. There's a reaction. And so, yeah, those oral histories, those oral storytellings have to be centered to what we do. It's the only means to making the situation better and actually giving the agency back to the people who determine their own history, the agents of change, of progress.
I'm told that we're getting close to the end point here. So if folks have closing thoughts or anything they want to add, maybe it's a good time to do that. Jim, you're muted.
Okay. Just quick. This effort to recover the history of common people that you might not be able to get anyplace else. Oral history was really critical in that. And it's at the front end of this movement of history from the bottom up. And Ken asked the question, and not just in the US and throughout Europe, but there was a big movement in South Africa, called History Workshop. And that did a lot of different things, but one of the important parts of that movement was forms of oral history, community-based oral history programs and so forth. In the late 60s, this was sometimes called guerrilla history. And young people especially went out and interviewed people in their communities. And it turns out that actually there's other sources that can be used to try to recover this history, but oral history certainly is an important way to do it. And it's probably done a little less these days, ironically, than it was for a long time. It's still done, but and it can be done within unions. You know, if you just use your imagination, I mean, it can be done in a lot of different ways, and it's a whole different perspective that you would not get otherwise.
I see Jermaine has her hand up.
It's yellow too. That's funny. I was just going to relate storytelling to my experience teaching, because there's a lot of teaching in union organizing, I found, and a lot of the same ideas relate to both. But when you tell a story, you're appealing to more than just ideas and you know, the part of people's brains that can think about ideas. You're going beyond that. You're also appealing to maybe some very more primitive parts of the brain that deal with sensory perception. So when you tell a story, that person is, the listeners are perhaps thinking about sounds and you know, visual things and maybe even odors, or, you know, you're appealing to more of their senses than just their abstract thought. And in teaching, we always try to appeal to students, and it works with adults, I'm sure, just as well as it does with kids. We try to appeal to as many of their senses as we can when we're teaching lessons, because it seems to, you know, be tied in with their memory. And so I think people have a greater understanding, they have a greater maybe attention to what you're saying when you appeal to their senses. And you can tell stories with movies, you can tell stories with, somebody said, song. So, you know, you've got music as well as the lyrics. And anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in. And, you know, so one-on-one experience in union organizing is really, really important. So I think this is one reason why, because when you're relating to someone one-on-one or even with a group, you know, you're telling stories. Probably you're telling something about your experience, and maybe they're sharing theirs. So again, so I hope that wasn't redundant, but just some thoughts I had while I was listening to everybody else.
Just to kind of, you know, my final point again, I just want to thank the IMC for doing this event, and I'm looking forward to the other programming that, you know, that you all are doing, because y'all are just amazing as always. So this is really the kind of things that we have to keep doing on a consistent basis, and spreading the word to other communities about these types of things too. It shouldn't just stop here, it should go other places. But we also have some oral history projects on the ground here that are just about to emerge. I'm doing a really cool podcast with the Human Research Institutes with Professor Antoinette Burton, and it's called Off the Shelf, Revolutionary Readings in Times of Crisis, where we're actually sitting down with scholars to discuss oral histories and the scholarship and the scholars themselves, and how those things are impacting, or how we can use those things to intervene in the current crises that we face. And we're starting off with Professor Lou Turner and his work on Hal Barron, who we can do a whole thing on by itself. So yeah, it's some really cool stuff that's happening here in Champaign, Urbana, about a new emerging type of storytelling. So just really excited to share that, and just look out for that too. So
I want to thank everyone for being here, everyone for being here. This has been truly amazing. I want to thank the panelists. You inspire me with your writings and with your radio shows, and with your showing up for events. And wow, I'm just going to mention that strikes that you guys have been involved with have changed my life. And that this community is fantastic. And I think that all of the people that are here make it fantastic. And on behalf of the IMC, we are celebrating our 20th anniversary, and we have survived 20 years, which is much longer than a lot of independent media centers have survived. And I think the way that we move forward as a community, especially during pandemics and the future challenges that we will come up with, is by being together. And so I want to thank the people who do Sounds Like Community, who started that at the IMC, for being able to bring us together. And I really want to point out your show, your radio show that is every Saturday over at WEFT, Radio Free Labor. A lot of great stories are told. You guys are truly amazing. A lot of good music is played also. And yeah, so WEFT might be the, I mean, we have WRFU over at the IMC, and World Labor Hour was over there for a while. We consider you guys a sister over there at WEFT, and community. It's all about community and sharing stories and getting together, even when we can't be together. So I want to thank everyone for everything. And now let's have a free for all. Everybody talk.
It was really good to see some of you I haven't seen in a long time.